And Brett Angell, welcome to Stockport County Live. I've got to say, it's a personal honour for myself to invite you onto the show. One of my favourite players growing up. Plenty of memories to speak about, in particular as time goes on. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm fine. Obviously, pre-COVID now, and we seem to be a little bit further down the path than yourself in the regards dealing with it. But so it's sort of back to near normality, as can be expected.
Well, we just had a quick chat there before we came on air. Just tell us a little bit about where you are in the world and what the situation has been for the last couple of months.
Basically, in New Zealand, we've been in, like every country, in lockdown. So we've not been able to actually get out of the confines of basically our own house and what have you. So, and that's been for the last sort of probably 2.5 months. It's been in that situation with the last sort of 2 to 3 weeks suddenly going from sort of what was level 4 to sort of level 1 fairly quickly in the last sort of month or so of doing it. But we've not had an active case for over 3 weeks in the country, and the only difference now is that the borders are closed for people returning, or realistically very little movement coming into the country, and that's the only difference in relation to people going back to work and everything else. Sport is both community and professionally back being played in the country, and that's all sort of happened over the course of last weekend.
And am I right in saying that you work in sport these days? So I mean that's probably good news for you personally that sport, both community and professional, is back up and running.
Yeah, well, I was working in sport up until pre-COVID, really, but COVID has actually sort of made life a little bit more difficult in relation to that.
Right.
So I'm sort of working through. I was due to go over to Australia and start a new position over there, but because of, as we say, COVID and the situation there, that's likely to be now a little bit more later than sooner. So prior to COVID coming in, I was due to go over and start a new position over in Northern New South Wales Football Federation. But unfortunately, that's not transcribed as quickly as what we'd have ideally liked it to have done. So we're still working through our sort of current status here. I'm due to actually start during the lockdown. I did actually do a real estate agent license and managed to pass that out. So I'm just in the throes of probably next week starting that as a new sideline, so to speak.
Right. Wow. Just a quick topic on the sport then. You mentioned crowds coming back in. How's that been taken over there? Because that's obviously that's a huge thing over here. We've got so many talking points for why crowds should or shouldn't be allowed back. How's that gone down? Are people just accepting it, or is there been any pushback?
Well, we've not had an active case for 3 weeks. So there's the difference, I think, in regards that people were sort of saying, well, why are we still in sort of lockdown when we've not had actually an active case for so long? So I think in relation to, allowing crowds back in, because there's not been an active case, I think we've been in a lot different position to back in England, where obviously there are a lot of active cases still going on and a lot of deaths happening still, and so therefore then you can really understand that until you're, I suppose, into the situation where New Zealand finds itself, which nobody really knows how long that's likely to be in England. But things did happen very quickly for us over here as well. So if it's sort of the same timelines, it could be that by sort of September, October, there may be that situation that crowds can return if there are no real active cases.
It goes without saying, you obviously keep a close eye on what's going on in England. Do you still have roots back home here? Do you still have friends and family that you're speaking to?
Yes, obviously, still very much involved in relation to keeping the finger on the pulse of what's going on with everybody and family and everything else, and obviously football-wise, following all of the former clubs and how they're doing and how they're progressing.
Well, that brings us nicely into football and how the clubs are progressing. In particular, the one that we're here for today, Stockport County. You'll have seen a successful season last season, or whether you can call it last season or the season before. Now, I'm still not 100%, but County winning the National League North, they claim the title there. Your former teammate Jim Gannon at the helm. How much do you know about what was going on last season? Were you able to keep an eye on that and maybe even speak to Jim at any point?
Yeah, I've not touched base with Jim for many years, but obviously I've followed the trials and tribulations, I suppose, since not being involved in the English League and everything. And it seems as though sort of it's taken an awful long time to get back to sort of what many fans could term normality, but I suppose it's over a generation of fans that realistically wouldn't really know completely what went on previously. When we look back and your local derby is Manchester City, and that was only 20 sort of years ago. But it is amazing how time sort of changes everything. And obviously, the club went through numerous sort of relegations, and it's really nice now to see that there are some little buds of joy coming out, that the club is making inroads into trying to move back to former glories.
I don't want to dwell too much on the negativity, especially because we've got so much positivity and positive topics to cover. But just on that, as a player who, I mean, let's have this right. You're a Stockport County legend. Let's not beat around that bush. So many fond memories, so many huge goals to look back on, cup runs, promotion, all this kind of stuff. When you say you're out of the English game, you're out of the Stockport County club actively, if you like, and you look on the news and you look on the internet, CFAX, as Big Kev called it the other day, or whatever. And you see the club are slipping down the leagues, and it's a relegation, or they've lost again, and this player's gone and that player's gone. How did that make you feel when you were kind of witnessing all that from afar?
Well, it's amazing that realistically, obviously, over here, nobody actually really knows that Stockport County was a league club. So it's quite difficult in that regards that, realistically, they were playing, when we were involved, they were playing championship football. Now they're, all intents and purposes, not a football club to that degree. So if we sort of look at it from where we left it, you're playing championship football, you're competing very strongly at that level, and everything else that came with that sort of is very easily taken for granted. But I think now, when supporters have gone through all of those ups and downs, they must appreciate so much more the ups where they were, and not take that for granted, as they can't take for granted that there's going to be an immediate return back to the Football League. There are so many clubs now, previous Football League clubs, trying to get back into the Football League, that it makes it harder and harder and harder just to stand still, really. And it is very frustrating, because you remember the good times, as all fans do, and it's frustrating that they seem so far away from that period or that time where, as we say, it was championship football, and your local game was Manchester City, not what it is at this current moment in time.
Yeah, no, I completely sympathise with you. Well, let's move on to more positive times, and I want to start way back from the beginning, really, because you obviously had two spells at County, so I think we've got to start at the beginning, so they say. Just talk us through how you first came about the club, because you're coming through, if I'm not mistaken, you started playing down south originally. So I'm guessing Stockport County wasn't a club that sprung to mind when you initially mapped out your future as a footballer.
No, you never really know what's around the corner. I was an apprentice at Portsmouth and then got released, but I played centre back all my life up until that point, and I'd never actually played up front. And then I went to Cheltenham and started to play up front. And my very first season there, which was conference level, ended with sort of me scoring 25 goals by February. And then suddenly there was a little bit more interest about potential clubs taking. And then I went to Derby, it wasn't Premier League then, because it was Division 1 as it was, because that was pre EPL. But I went there, and as I said, I'd only actually been playing up front for, well, a season and just a little bit. So not even 2 seasons. And suddenly I was at a Premier League club as it was. And things didn't really work out there. And then there was an opportunity of actually just basically getting some first team experience. And Stockport at that time were in the old 4th division, and were always sort of, in many instances, just about holding their end up to staying off the bottom of the 4th division. And in those days, it was re-election for teams that were in the bottom of the league. But it was a lovely, as I said, I had probably not the greatest experience at Derby. Things hadn't really worked out. And I suppose coming into Stockport, it gave me an opportunity for me to build confidence. And also the club had a very family orientated feel around it. Obviously, it didn't have the facilities that it has got now. But I remember when obviously the home end was actually didn't have a stand. It was just basically a brick wall, and there was I think a nightclub behind it that generally if you miss the target, you hit that, and that's what sort of, and now you've got a magnificent, 5,000 seater stand behind that. But I remember when it was absolutely open, and basically it was the car park. The car park was behind it, and there was a 6-foot wall that had a couple of steps that fans used to congregate on and stand behind. And I don't know whether, there's obviously many fans that will remember that, but that is where that's what I remember about my first, term at Stockport. That was what the club was. And in many instances, the player base that were there were professional footballers, but there was no real sort of long-term aims for those professional footballers. They were just trying to do the best that they could from year to year and gain another contract.
I'm completely enthralled in hearing of County in those days, and I want to pick your brains on that a little more in just a sec. But I just want to touch on something you said before that, when you've gone from effective non-league to effective Premier League after less than a season and a half in that position. That's a story that you're just not going to hear. You hear stories quite a lot, not as often as I think we would like, but you hear stories quite a lot of players who go from non-league and they have the honeymoon dream, if you like, up to the Prem. But you don't hear it all that often from players who've played less than 2 seasons in that position, and they've gone from centre half to centre forward. And all of us, I mean, what goes through your mind when your boss or agent or whoever it was sits you down and says, "There's a Division 1 club, they're interested in signing you." How? Just talk us what happens there.
So in those days, it was an agent. So we go back. So obviously nowadays it would be. There started to become a lot of, should we say, rumours of people that were observing or watching me perform from week to week at the conference level at Cheltenham. And then there started to be a little bit of talk around through the papers about potential teams that might have an interest. Newcastle United were at one stage rumoured around that time, as well as, and then, as I said, it just came from a phone call really from the manager to say that they'd had contact with Derby County. They want to take a look, and would you be interested in sort of, going down taking a look at their facilities and training facilities and what have you. And then realistically, it came from there. So I went down, had a look, did some training. Training went really well. In fact, we managed to, I think we were doing an 11v11 game, and obviously we did end up scoring in that 11v11 game. And then obviously Derby were interested in taking it further, and then that's exactly what happened. So I signed a contract, with Derby, and it probably happened, and it happens very quickly. But it was very sort of roller coaster. So in one instance, you've been released by a football league club to be told that you're not quite ready, or
Yeah.
and then suddenly you've got a lot of Division 1 clubs having an interest in you because you've changed position. And to be fair, the positional change was probably something that I think without it, I would have never been able to actually have earned the living that I did in the game, because it just felt a lot more natural. But it was interesting because it had been muted at Portsmouth. About the chief scout did speak to me about, had you ever thought about playing as a centre forward?
Further forward,
yeah. So it wasn't something that, and maybe it was that gave us the sort of, that deeper thought, having been released, about sort of suddenly thinking, well, why don't we give it a go?
So you have this move, and it sounds unbelievable. It sounds like you say an utter roller coaster. Now, one thing, because we're doing this Legend series at the moment, and we speak to so many kind of former players from this era and that era, and one name that comes up a lot is Danny Bergara. Now he's credited with the kind of architecture, if you like, of modern day county. The fact that it was his assistant Dave Jones that then went on to progress the club further. The fact that it was his signing Jim Gannon that's there now. There's so much of that, but it wasn't Danny that brought you to the club. I mean, I think I'm right in saying you had time with Danny, but correct me if I'm wrong, it was Asa Hartford before.
That's right,
Danny. So you've seen that transition. You've seen pre-Danny, and then during Danny, and then post-Danny. Just give us if you would, just run us through the differences, the experiences that those three kind of stages of the club's life went through.
Well, I think when obviously Asa brought us, so Asa obviously from a playing perspective had a very, very decent career, international footballer and what have you, and was going through trying to establish himself as a coach. For some reason, it didn't really quite work out. And then Danny came in. So Danny had been working, I think, at Sheffield United prior to coming to Stockport. And I think this was his first real manager's role. I think at Sheffield United, he'd been working with some of the either reserves or younger teams rather than as first team manager. So I think this was Danny's first role. And the difference that I saw with Danny was that, and certainly for someone such as my position that realistically didn't really know the job as a centre forward, I think he then gave me that confidence to sort of actually build and also give some hints and tips about broadening my experience and my understanding of that position and playing that position so therefore then he was the first coach that I would sort of say in some instances, not so much coach, but actually give you some advice and support allied to a little bit of coaching, because up to that point I had never been coached. I'd never really understood the position. I knew realistically there was what I'd call a natural ability in anticipation when the ball was in and around the 18-yard box. But again, that was a more natural feeling and understanding rather than somebody getting hold of you and actually giving you some, useful advice that made sense when you were actually out there playing as well. So I think Danny brought that in. And also I think Danny started to bring in a little more younger, hungrier player rather than the probably older pro. There was a good mix, but maybe Danny started to evolve that sort of younger hunger type of player that had a little point to prove, had been involved with other clubs that were probably at higher levels, but had never really quite made the breakthrough. So Jim and players like that, Andy Priest and Kevin Francis, had all been in those sort of situations like myself, where things hadn't quite worked for at the level that they were playing, but the teams that they were involved with were generally of a higher level than Stockport were. And I think Danny sort of started to build that sort of understanding and looked for that sort of hungry, younger type of player to mix with the more experienced player. And I think over time that evolved stronger and stronger. Now, I'm probably on the first wave of that, where realistically I started the process and never really finished it. Jim come through the whole process, and I sort of came back and because Dave was actually the youth coach at that time as well, so I'd had experience with Dave as well, in relation to that. He was at the football club as a youth coach and doing the youth team. So therefore then, but it wasn't until the 5-6 years later that I came back and obviously then played once again for it. But that's what I feel that Danny started to bring. Danny started to bring that sort of hunger, the more hungry, up and coming type of player that could actually take the club through. We just missed out, I think, in Danny's first season. We just missed out. We made the playoffs, but that was as far as we got. And we sort of, I suppose, and I think that was the very, very first year of the playoffs. And we went to Chesterfield, from what I can remember, and basically we were out of the game before we were, the first leg. I think we lost 4-0, so we were more or less, finished with the season through that playoff. And I think, again, the experience of players going through that and understanding it better held it in better esteem as they continue to retain involvement in the playoffs, because it is a little bit more about experience, and you're a lot wiser for that experience when you go into that sort of situation again, in preceding years.
So you then, after that season, you move on from Stockport, and I mean, you don't have to be a football genius and study the game to a huge extent to see you've got big followings, not just at Stockport County. I go on kind of South End reports and stuff, and they refer to Big Brett as the legend, and we had this great partnership up there, and that must be something that makes you really proud when you look back as a retired footballer, and you can think, I'm a legend at these clubs. There are these clubs where if I go to that part of the world, I'm not going to have to buy a drink all night, because there's always going to be someone who wants to come and see you, wants to speak to you. And that's a real credit to you. You've gone on and played through the divisions, but you've then come back to Stockport. And you touched on Dave Jones there. Now, a few of those names you mentioned, Kevin Francis, Andy Priest, Mike Flynn, obviously Jim we speak to every week. They will regularly bring up the relationships between Danny Bergara, Dave Jones, John Sainty, and how each of them played a key role in the development of the players, the progression of the club and the team, and so on and so forth. You're in that position now where you've seen the transition, like you mentioned there. You've seen Danny get the ball rolling, get the wheel spinning, call it what you like. You've then left, gone away, done great things. You've come back to the club, and I guess that wheel is further down the road, whatever the saying is, but the progression is very apparent. Dave Jones has taken the helm. The philosophy is continuing. What was it like when you came back?
There was a bigger expectation. There was a feeling that with the group of players that Dave had at his disposal, things were likely to start to happen. Obviously, old faces. Jim was still there. Flinney was still there, all of those people. So you still had that nucleus of player base that had come through that system. So they'd achieved coming out of Division 3 into, Division 2. And this was the one where realistically, Stockport had never been. They'd never been in the Championship. But I did get the feeling that there was a school of thought or a feeling amongst not only the fans, but the player base, that the group that was being sort of put together potentially had the ability to actually move into the higher areas of Division 2. And there was a big expectation that if things worked out that way, it was feasible and not sort of
pipe dream.
Feeling that no, that we're this is ridiculous. We're not that good. So when I first came, and I came on loan, and I came very early in the season. It was within, but I wasn't available. I remember I wasn't available for the early games, and there was this big expectation. I remember watching. I came and watched the pre-season game. I think it was Birmingham. It might have been the one where Trevor Francis was moaning about the pitch, but I remember watching. I remember watching the pre-season game, and obviously there was a little bit of a buzz around the place that things were sort of, and obviously there were players that had come in again. So Alan had come exactly the same sort of way of, you could say, myself and Jim and Flinney and players like that, where they'd been at bigger clubs, but things hadn't, for whatever reason, quite worked out. Yeah. And Alan had come from Newcastle, had joined and was starting to develop, a little bit more of a reputation. There was, so a lot of talk around Alan's ability and, what potentially could happen around that. And that was obviously one thing that struck me from watching, that Alan did appear as though he was, looking as though he was going in the right direction. And there was a hunger within him that he wanted to get back to where he'd come from. And I think that was probably very relevant. And I think Dave probably picked that up from not only from Danny as well, because again, if we go back to the starting point, talking about players with a bit of hunger that had been, I think Dave followed that very closely as well. And as I said, there was a lot of sort of, expectation. We had Tom and we had Maz in the middle of midfield, and you just got the feeling, again, both of those players had played at higher levels with higher clubs and still felt that they had a lot to prove in relation to their ability and what they were capable of doing. And I think that was relevant. Like Jonesy came in goal. I think that was very relevant. Again, he came from Wolves. So it was another one that realistically hadn't been able to establish himself, but came into an environment where he was given the opportunity to establish himself and move forward. So I do remember that there was a lot of expectation, but I also remember that we probably made the worst start of any county team in that first sort of 5 or 6 games. I don't think at that point, I think it took us about 5 or 6 games to win the first one.
Yeah, it did. You're right. Can I just ask you, just going back to that time, how did the conversation come about with Dave? Because did he reach out to you? Did you speak to him when he said, Brett, look, we want you back? I've worked with you before. I know you, like you say, maybe you played higher up and you want to get back to that level, whatever. What happened there? How did the move back come about?
Well, I suppose, again, I was in one of those downward spirals from the roller coaster. I was on the down to. So I was at Sunderland at the time. So they were championship playing. And also at that moment in time, there was a lot happening outside. We were just had our second child, or moving towards having our second child. I was still actually living in Formby, but commuting or had a place in so some of those situations weren't ideal. And allied to that, I wasn't actually playing at that time, from the first team perspective. So there was a lot going on, probably more so outside the game. But also from a playing perspective, I wasn't actually playing at that time for Sunderland either. So what I did feel is that I needed to get back closer to home. So that was one element of which Stockport was. It was a lot closer at that time than Sunderland. So there were elements of that. And also I needed to get back again playing, because that was another thing as well. And I think the two sort of intertwined together. Stockport was a lot closer for family, and also Stockport gave me the opportunity to play first team football and re-establish myself again.
So it was a no-brainer. There was a name that you touched on. There was a name that you touched on a few moments ago, and I think we've teased listeners and viewers long enough now. I have to ask you about that partnership, possibly up there with maybe Kevin Francis and Andy Priest. In my opinion, maybe just suggesting maybe even superior to Kevin Francis and Andy Priest is the Alan Armstrong, Brett Angell, unbelievable strike force. What do you remember? Because you already remember, which I wasn't expecting, if I'm honest, you to relive what you knew of Alan before you got playing together. But when you started playing together, just talk us through what it was like playing with Alan.
I think the greatest thing about partnerships are, one, that they complement each other, and I think me and Alan did complement each other. So there were elements of the game that were strengths for me and potential weaknesses for Alan, and vice versa. Alan will always tell you he did all of my running. And to a degree, he was probably right in that respect, but I do feel that I did share the load as equally as I could. He was just better and quicker at getting into those areas. But I do think that we did complement each other very well. And with that, there became a better understanding of each other's game and what each other would do in certain situations, which is what you get as you tend to train and play together more consistently. You start to understand their game as well as your own, and what they're likely to be looking to do that can actually help and aid you. And I think that was probably the reason why we complement each other well, and did so well in relation to the outcomes that came about. I think there was always a goal threat, and think that we managed to convert a lot of opportunities into actual goals.
Yeah,
be that me or be that with Alan. So when your two strikers are realistically getting to sort of like 40 goals between them, you know that you've got a bit of a platform that basically, I think that's the good thing when it's not self-reliant on one player. So opposition can cut out one, but it's a lot more difficult to cut out two. And I think from that point of view, me and Alan complement each other very well, where we were able to actually utilize those skill sets that we both had that were different to each other. And it made it very difficult for the opposition to actually nullify both, in that regard. And I think then as we got more sort of regular playing together, like I said, I think it flowed from there. And I think the fans saw that realistically. And I think the opposition did as well. They knew that there was a big play. So when we played together, there wasn't just, well, if we stop him, we stop their main outcome. If we stopped him, if it was stopped me, then Alan was likely to turn up with a goal, and vice versa. But there were other players as well that obviously helped to that. But I think it was just a question that we were, you could say, on the same wavelength, but I think it was one of those where, again, it was a little bit more natural as a partnership. I had one actually at the same at Southend as well with Ian Benjamin. He complimented me because a lot of his game I wasn't that great at. And Alan was exactly the same. He was a lot better at holding the ball in and what have you. He was a lot better at getting down those little inside channels and opening the game up for us. And I never really had, or never that wasn't my forte, but it was Alan's forte. So, and where probably when the ball came into the box, I was a little bit more of a natural predator than Alan was.
Yeah.
But then likewise, it sort of complemented each other. And as I said, it was a joy to play with him. And I found it very easy to play with Alan because you sort of picked up what he was going to do a lot easier. And obviously, we're playing so many games together, you start to build that sort of confidence within each other and what each other is going to do.
Is it that honesty and that kind of self recognition, if you like, that propels a good partnership, but B all round player? Because I mean, let's be honest, right? As a striker, I'm sure you will have met many strikers with their egos like this. Okay, and they want to believe that they're the best player around and they're the key to the team and so on and so forth. And that's fine. I think you have to have a little bit of swagger if you're a striker. But the fact that you can say, okay, look, there are parts of my game that he's better at. And because of that, I know that I'm going to work better with him. Rather than just try and take the mantle off each other, to share that platform, that's what makes us such a successful partnership / individual player.
Yeah, I think it goes hand in hand. I think the problem, everything is revolving around goals, because no matter whether you're playing the best you've ever played, week in and week out, it'll always be if you're scoring, suddenly you're playing better anyway. Everybody believes that you're playing better because you've scored. But then there are moments within that where realistically, you're not playing that well, but you pop up with a goal and suddenly everything else is forgotten. So scoring consistently is part and parcel of realistically the thing that's going to grab everybody's attention and get that thing. I think the rest of it then comes from the experience of knowing you're going to go through spells where it's not going to quite go in for you. And you're going to go through spells where basically whatever happens, it finds its way in the net and you add another goal. But with scoring regularly, you then build an expectation. There's an expectation that you become, to a certain degree, a 20 goals a season man. Yeah. Yeah. So therefore, then there's an expectation. Well, realistically, we expect him, and that's why we bring him into the team. So therefore, then and I think as time wore on, I think with Alan, he began to get goals more, a lot more regularly than possibly where he started with. So I think his all-round game improved, but also his goal scoring output also improved. Whereas probably you'd look at me and sort of many people would say there's always been a goals output, but from an overall perspective, what does he bring to the team, in that regard? So therefore then, but as a striker, I suppose it's the goals that people will sort of veer toward, as though, oh, he's done really well, rather than the all round. And it's interesting because now that you're a coach, I can see all of the sort of little things that realistically work and don't work, and where you're sort of saying if they're fighting amongst each other for the kudos, it must be difficult. But realistically, the kudos, and I'd always sort of say the kudos will come when the timing is right. And for Alan, he got his move and everything else because he deserved that. But sometimes it happens when it needs to happen, rather than there are deficiencies in your game that realistically are going to be found out potentially at some point if you go too quick too soon type thing.
Were you good friends with Alan off the pitch? I always got the impression that you were.
Well, I think from that point of view, we understood each other. I wouldn't say we were, meals and wives and all of that. But from a playing perspective, I understood Alan, and I think Alan understood me as well in that regards, that he respected what we brought to the group, and what I tried to do or tried to support him in relation to, to again giving them little words of wisdom of
Yeah.
what to do and when to do it, that Danny probably, because realistically I was probably the same age when I first came as Alan was when we were
of course.
playing together. You know, it was that early 20s, you know, and everything else. So, you know, so yeah, as I said, I think it was just they don't come around that often, but I think it was a partnership that was right for both of us, you know, from that point of view.
When you mention it's goals that are remembered, you know, it's goals that people speak of and everything else, you're right. Is there which goals, if you like, which goals stick out for you? I mean, I can think of a few, but don't let me take this mantle. When you think back to your spell at County, with Alan, without Alan, just speaking on a Brett Angell front, which goals are the ones that you're going to sit down by the fireplace and tell the kids about?
I think, look, I come back. I think the run in the League Cup was absolutely enormous. You know, it gave us so much pleasure playing and supporting. It was just such a great, you know, feeling, you know, around that. So all of the goals that were scored during that run always come back to mind in relation to that. Obviously, I think that it'll always be the Chesterfield goal that actually brought the, you know, championship football. And then when we were in the championship, I'll always forget and I'll always remember the Manchester City derby when we're 3-0 up within 25 minutes. And in essence, we're the better team and they know we're the better team and they can't deal with it and everything else. And, you know, and I'm sure that will stick in your mind and every county fan that came to that game. And it's like utopia, isn't it? You know, suddenly you go, pinch me because we are 3-0 up within 25 minutes against Manchester City. It shouldn't happen, you know. And I think that probably sort of epitomised where we were in relation to that. It was the first year back in the first year in the championship. I think we were in the sort of top 8 pushing up, and City I think were then looking to try and stay in the championship, which unfortunately they didn't manage to do. But you know, I think that's, yes, they did get their own back when at Main Road, and that had its own game because I remember playing in goal in that one. So you know, and I also remember, and it's funny, I remember Aaron's first goal, and I'll never ever forget his face when he recognised he actually scored. Aaron Wilbraham, when he actually recognised that was his first goal, and he actually recognised, and I'll always remember his face when he recognised he'd actually scored. It was It was like delayed. It was like a delayed reaction, and then suddenly his face lit up.
Yeah,
but it was almost like, again, what's gone on here?
Yeah,
what has happened? Yes, you've just scored.
That must be amazing.
It didn't really go far because I think it was a consolation. But yeah, and I think those are the goals that the moments that stick with you, because again they were big moments with the club. And I think there were big moments all the way through for me personally to help and support the club from, you know, moving it further forward into what it was. You know, as I say, and having full houses there, you know, 10,000 I think was full house, 11,000, and it was absolutely. And I remember that, you know, I think after City fans, after, you know, half an hour, decided that they weren't staying around for it, but you know,
no,
yeah.
What a shame. So I don't want to keep you. I don't want to keep you for too long, Brett. I know that we've gone over the agreed time frame, as I find myself saying a lot at the moment. But I can't end this with just talking about how when it came towards the end of your county career, you saw so many of the good times. In fact, you were key to the good times. Just your overall memories of the club and how they sit within you and your heart and your feelings these days, because you're on the other side of the world now. You live a different life now. You're still involved in sport, but you know the club is part of your history, if you like, although you're obviously always welcome back with open arms. Where do they sit within you? When you think of Stockport County, what what comes to mind? What keeps you going?
Well, it's the good times. That's what I'm sort of saying. It's the times where I sort of look back, and this is the time for sort of reminiscing. And you look back and you sort of feel like, realistically, and obviously Stockport and Southend, where you're talking about supposedly, you've attained legendary status. It's just so frustrating that both of those clubs were in championship clubs when I left them. And it's so frustrating that the good times have not been able to be, even, both clubs are going through real hard times where they're probably going back to where they were. In many instances, when we turn full circle, Stockport were a club that was struggling to hold its Football League status when I first joined it. And then we were, championship status. And Southend had always been a lower league level club. And, we moved it into, again, exactly the same thing, where the player base had a hunger and a desire to want to improve and move forward. And most of those players as well had come into from higher level clubs at one stage, but needed first team football. And so Stockport will always be so strong in my emotions and my feelings for the game, always have been. And it always will be, because of the experiences that we had. It's such a great family club, but it was a club that was moving into areas that it shouldn't have been, because realistically it never had the right to be dealing with the teams that it was playing against week in and week out, because it was Stockport County. And it was great to see the fan base. When I first joined it, the fan base was a couple of thousand, and we were having sort of realistically 8,000 watching. So it drawn, and it's interesting that, as I say, as generations of fans come and go, there's going to be two generations that don't even really understand that we were at championship level, and that's what not so much disappoints. It's just so frustrating that all of the work that had gone in to realistically get it to that point now as seen. But then that's what happens. Sometimes you have that sort of feeling that you go back to what you were. You've had your good times, and you go back to realistically the level that you were really came from. But it's such a shame that that the club sort of even dropped even further, right out, and and have been in the wilderness, so to speak. But hopefully now there's, as I said, there's signs that the wilderness has departed, and that we can get ideally back to Football League status, and from there back to hopefully where we left off, so to speak. And then the new generation of fans can start talking about the good times. Do you remember when we went and had that tremendous League Cup run, and we got promoted and everything else? And I'm sure, like yourself, those are always in the memory, but you hanker for those times again, or just really some of the good times that realistically you can tell your kids and sort of say, I was there, I was there when that happened, and I was there when that happened, and everything else. And it's the same as a player. I'm very proud to have actually supported the club and given opportunity for the club to prosper and to move forward, and that will always stay with me regardless of where we are in the world. And that's the same, and that's all I want, is that that you fans can experience the good times and tell your children about the good times and the travels that you've had throughout, and and they stick in the memory.
Just finally, Brett, do you have any plans post COVID or Corona? We would love to have you back for it. Maybe, I don't know if you're getting the first team these days. No offense, but we've got a pretty good squad at the moment. But just to have you back, just for a game or two, welcome you back and catch a drink after the game or something. Do you have any plans to come back over?
In the near future, not at this current moment in time, but rest assured, look, keep in touch, because as I said, if I do, I would like to, visit again and see and everything about the club and what have you. So it's certainly nothing immediate, but likewise, it's certainly not ruled out.